Hello, I'm Matt Lampert.
Greetings, I'm Robert Folsom.
Welcome to Mood in Markets, where we talk about how social mood moves trends in financial markets and beyond. In today's episode, the area beyond the financial markets that has our attention is U.S. presidential elections, particularly the times when waves of negative mood have helped third parties to make a splash in the race for the White House.
The October 2016 and the January 2024 issue, which is the current issue of the Socionomics, they both explored the topic admirably well, and we'll touch on highlights from those articles. Yet this topic is socionomically rich enough so that there's more to say about the past and its relevance to the present.
That's right, and to set the socionomic stage, let's begin by noting that the rise in popularity of third-party candidates is typically something we see when social mood grows negative and the political consensus fractures. We'll look at some noteworthy examples of that. As our colleague Brian Whitmer says, negative social mood is like a centrifuge that flings votes from the political center toward the periphery. In such cases, third-party candidates benefit as more voters tire of the status quo and grow inclined to consider options outside the mainstream.
Right, and it follows that to know a bit of history of third parties could prove extremely relevant to America's political future, namely the 2024 presidential election. If we look at earlier presidential elections, we can point to at least three examples when the social mood at the time helped give rise to third-party candidates, and they in turn played a decisive role in the outcome.
Now, as a rule, third-party candidates are on the ballot in presidential elections, and as you say, a few times, third-party candidates have arguably made a decisive difference in the outcome, have they not?
Yeah, and indeed, Matt, arguably is the key word, because you can't truly know. You can only speculate about a counterfactual. And so right up front, we'll state the obvious. Third-party candidates equal more complicated presidential elections. Three or more candidates means that sometimes the winner will not get a majority of the popular vote. If you have 40% of the popular vote and the second and third place candidates each get around 30%, then 40% wins the vote by plurality.
Robert, it gets still more confounding because, of course, the popular vote is not how we elect presidents in the U.S.
Alas, we don't. So now we have to mention the dreaded electoral college, because that is how we elect presidents. The founding fathers were afraid of political parties. They called them factions. And they were also afraid of one-man, one-vote elections for president. So they put the electoral college in the Constitution. And it is literally an 18th century anachronism, which is why no other self-governing country does it that way.
This isn't a perfect analogy, Robert, but the Electoral College reminds me of how the U.S. uses imperial weights and measures while nearly everybody else uses the metric system.
Well, yeah, that analogy makes the point, doesn't it? It's like how the U.S. uses Fahrenheit temperatures, but the rest of the world uses Celsius. So back to the Electoral College, what it does is allocate electors to each of the 50 individual states based on state population. Our state of Georgia has 16 electors. California's huge population gives it 55 electors. But if, say, presidential candidate Smith gets 50.2% of the vote in Georgia versus candidate Jones getting 49.8%, Smith gets all of Georgia's 16 electors. And again, this is true for all but two of the 50 states.
Right, and as you're pointing out, then we can see how the Electoral College can yield an outcome that differs from the outcome of the popular vote.
Yeah, and when it comes to distorting the popular vote, the worst case is for a presidential candidate to win the popular vote nationally, but not win in the Electoral College. And that has happened in 5 presidential elections, 2 of them in the relatively recent past, in 2000 and again in 2016.
Our point here, of course, is not to offer a civics lesson on the particulars of the Electoral College, but rather just to demonstrate how a third-party candidate that merely draws a few thousand supporters away from one candidate or another in a handful of states can end up having a disproportionate impact on the outcome of the election. And it's when you throw negative social mood into the mix that third parties can have a shot to do more than grab a few percent of the vote. but potentially rock the boat enough to destabilize the status quo.
Yeah, and not just destabilize it, it can be downright combustible.
I trust you have some examples in mind.
When it comes to combustible, Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, that's the big one. He's the one and only third-party candidate who won the presidency. And in 1860, negative social mood was in extreme territory. In fact, it had trended lower for years. The stock market debt was down, the economy was down, and so politically, the U.S. wasn't simply polarized, it was splintered. And the issues were economic, like trade and tariffs, and the regional splits in the North, the South, and the West had become acute, most of all regarding slavery.
And if we look at a chart, we can see that the record high in the stock market at the time was recorded back in the 1830s. So using the stock index as our measure of social mood, it reveals that mood had been quite dour for decades. One other political casualty of the negative mood trend, by the way, was Martin Van Buren, who lost his bid for re-election in a landslide in 1840, near a significant low in the market. And by the time the election of 1860 rolls around, another negative mood extreme was near, and this combustible atmosphere, well, that ends up being a pretty appropriate word to describe the scene.
Yeah, and Matt, that's all of that is what was in place at the 1860 election, and before what happened after that election. I said Lincoln was a third-party candidate. In fact, the 1860 election had 4 candidates, and in turn, that split the popular vote and the electoral vote 4 ways. The turnout for this election was more than 80%. It was record-setting. Yet, the popular vote for Abe Lincoln was less than 40%. He basically wasn't even on the ballot in the southern states. Bottom line is 6 in 10 voters did not vote for Lincoln. And yet, Lincoln did win a majority in the Electoral College, although the disconnect between the electoral vote versus the popular vote, it was the most extreme of any presidential election. Stephen Douglas was the second most popular votes, almost 30% of the total. He received only 12 electoral votes and carried 1 state. And by the way, Matt, I assume you've heard that after the 1860 election, about 1/3 of the states seceded from the Union, and that led to a 4-year civil war, and it cost the lives of approximately 700,000 Americans.
Wow, the Civil War, of course, is another extreme manifestation of that prior negative extreme and the social mood trend. Robert, earlier we said third-party candidates have arguably made a decisive difference in presidential elections. This sounds like the one election where it's not really arguable, is it?
Touche, Matt. That's not a counterfactual. The third-party candidate won, and that was actually not the case in our second example, the 1912 presidential election. And the semi-short version is Teddy Roosevelt was the third-party candidate in 1912. He'd already been a Republican president for most of 2 terms, and Roosevelt had endorsed the man who followed him by winning the White House in 1908, and that was Republican William Taft. But by 1912, Roosevelt wanted to be president again. He tried and failed to get the Republican nomination. The party had said no way because Taft was an incumbent running for a second term, and they often get that second term. So Roosevelt said, fine, I'll run as the Bull Moose Party candidate, which I think is the greatest ever name for a political party. The former name was the Progressives. Roosevelt had remained very, very popular in the time between 1908 and 1912. And so in turn, and this is where the counterfactual begins, he split the vote among Republicans in 1912. And that means Roosevelt received 27% of the popular vote, Taft received 23%, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the election with 42% of the popular vote. Again, the Electoral College was disconnected from what voters did. Roosevelt and Taft combined to receive more than 50% of the popular vote, but only 94 electoral votes. Wilson's 42% of the popular vote, that translated to 435 electoral votes. Now, social mood at the time was negative, and negative in a very specific way, as you know well, Matt, because you and several colleagues cited 1912 in a scholarly paper.
Yes, in our 2012 paper, Robert Prechter Wade Parker, Deepak Goel, and I charted the 1912 election as an example of an incumbent getting ousted in a landslide. And the role of the third party here is interesting, as it is an instance of social mood finding a way to get what it wants when it wants it. Negative mood encouraged an incumbent's ousting, and your analysis, Robert, suggests that Roosevelt's run as a third-party candidate helped to make that happen. And Robert, our socionomic perspective, I suppose, also has a bearing on your third example, which is the 1968 election.
Right, indeed, in the sense especially that if Democrat Lyndon Johnson had run as the incumbent in 1968, and he was eligible to do so, social mood and the stock market were against him. He won by a landslide in 64, but by 68, he had become deeply unpopular. And just coincidentally, the stock market had turned south in 1966, and Johnson in 68 wasn't even sure that the Democrats would agree to renominate him for a second elected term. He declined to run. So instead, Democrats nominated Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. Richard Nixon ran as the Republican. And as for the third-party candidate, his name was George Wallace. He'd been governor of Alabama. As for his story, I can't do better than a quote that's in the January 2024 issue of the Socionomics. Quote, "One of history's most controversial and incendiary political figures, Wallace was an anti-civil rights, pro-segregationist, radical nationalist," end quote. And here again, in 1968, the third-party candidate split the vote. And at the time, this may sound really weird to younger viewers, at the time, Southern states voted heavily for Democrats. Wallace had been a Democrat, and he knew that as a third-party candidate, he'd have a fighting chance to win several Southern states, and that is exactly what happened. Wallace won the majority in 5 states, all in the South, and in the popular vote nationally, he got 13.5%, which was about 10 million votes. In turn, Nixon won the 68 election with 43.4% of the popular vote. Hubert Humphrey lost with 42.7% of the popular vote. And, Matt, lots of scholars and historians say that the George Wallace votes would have gone to Humphrey. I think they're right, but that's a counterfactual claim.
And again, our theme here is that the trend toward negative social mood destabilized the political status quo, this time with an extreme third-party candidate drawing a substantial percentage of the vote and even carrying multiple states, something we have not seen since then. The best showing from a third-party candidate in the popular vote since Wallace was Ross Perot. That was the 1992 election, and that's one of my favorite elections to study as a socionomist. It seems like each time I go back to it, there's something new to discover. And it's interesting because it's one of only 2 cases in U.S. history where nominal stock prices had registered a gain greater than 20% net over the 3 years before Election Day, and yet the incumbent still lost.
Right, and one nuance to that is that the value line measure, which is a broader measure of stock market performance, it had been net negative in the 3 or so years that led to the election. And more importantly, the 92 election happened in the shadow of a correction that doesn't look like much on a long-term chart, but negative mood at the time was still very clear to see. Grunge music and fashions became popular. The Gulf War had erupted earlier in the correction, but it ended a year before the vote. And in politics, a third-party candidate made a strong enough showing to contribute to the ouster of an incumbent president. So Matt, we've covered a bit of the history. Perhaps you can remind us of the levels in the Dow we should keep an eye on as we move toward the 2024 election.
Yes, that's right. Let's take a look at that. Now, we did just mention that George H.W. Bush in 92 was one of 2 incumbents to lose despite a 20% net gain in the market in the 3 years leading up to Election Day. But that is certainly the exception. Generally, that 20% net gain threshold has corresponded to good news for incumbents, as they've won better than 87% of the time under such conditions. In the 2024 race, that level corresponds to a reading of the Dow of 42,984. So if the Dow were to be above that level on Election Day, history has favored the incumbent in such circumstances. Now, on the other side of the coin, 80% of first-term incumbents have lost their re-election bids, when the Dow had experienced a net loss of 5% or more in the 3 years leading up to Election Day. For 2024, that level corresponds in the Dow to a reading of 34,029. So if the Dow is below that level, could be good news for challengers, including third parties, to make some waves. But the really interesting zone here, Robert, is when the Dow is between those two key levels. That's what we call coin flip territory. Historically, incumbents have won about half the time when the election has been held in that range. So that's another zone where a third party could make a splash, as again, just siphoning off 10,000 votes here, 10,000 votes there in key states to a third party candidate could impact the ultimate outcome. So if you are a third party candidate or consultant, basically, as long as the Dow is below that 42,984 mark, history suggests that your candidate has an opportunity to shake things up in a meaningful way.
This is the time to say something we've often repeated, that a lot can happen in the mood trend and in the markets between now and Election Day. We do have some key levels to watch. I guess that leads us to wrap up for the day.
Let's do that, Robert. To our viewers, thank you for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the conversation, give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell. It really does help the channel. Robert, thank you so much for this conversation. Let's talk again soon.
Thank you, Matt. Let's talk soon.